Are you tired of feeling like you're always falling short when the pressure's on? Do you find yourself choking in crucial moments, whether it's during a big presentation, a sports match, or dreaded test? Well, you're not alone. At some point, we have all experienced this frustrating feeling of choking under pressure. And in this video, we'll explore the science behind why it happens, and more importantly, what you can do about it. So if you're ready to stop letting pressure hold you back and instead start thriving under it, then this is the video for you. So let's get started. So what actually is choking under pressure? Well, let's imagine you're tasked with scoring the final penalty in the shootout to secure victory for your side. It's just a simple kick from 12 yards. But you feel your heart thumping in your chest, your legs feel a bit wobbly, your mouth's as dry as the desert, and all you can hear are the taunts and boos from opposing fans. You then look up to the goal, it looks tiny, and the goalkeeper looks massive. Your mind starts racing, you think of those dangerous words. What if I miss? And it's too late, your mind is now racing to that moment. The humiliation, the shame, and the pain of letting your teammates down. You run up to the ball without control or purpose, and you end up smashing it high over the bar. This is a prime example of choking under pressure. Quite simply, choking under pressure is a phenomenon that occurs when individuals fail to perform at their best in high-stakes situations, despite being fully capable under normal circumstances. It's like hitting a mental roadblock right when you need to be at the top of your game. Scoring a penalty is one of the easiest things to do in football. The odds are stacked way more in your favour than the goalkeepers, and chances are you score 99% of them in practice. So what changes? Well, the only thing that changes is the mental context of the situation. You see, choking under pressure starts off as a cognitive process that then dramatically impacts a range of physiological processes. Choking happens because our brain engages in a threat response to something in our external environment. In other words, we perceive a situation as important, where there is an element of risk involved, or the stakes are high when thinking about the possible consequences of succeeding in this situation or not. And this then triggers our fight-flight response, which is hardwired into all of us when we face stressful situations. Your body goes into survival mode. It's like flipping a switch that activates a whole bunch of changes to either help you fight off the threat or run away from it. And when this response is triggered, we release a cocktail of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And it is these that end up causing those physical changes we've all experienced when facing a high pressure moment. So things like increased breathing and heart rate, your pupils dilating, and increased sweating. In sport, a lot of these changes include vascular shunting, where blood flow is redirected and increased to certain areas such as your brain or major limbs. And the point of this is to carry more oxygen to these areas, so in theory we can think clearer and execute more powerful, precise movements better. But the problem is, when these changes occur, they often feel uncomfortable. They make us feel nauseous and agitated. And unfortunately, we often interpret them as something bad and harmful. And so if left unchecked, what happens is that when in this state, your working memory becomes impaired, meaning that you have trouble making sense of and acting on new information. So that's why movements you've previously executed to perfection thousands of times before suddenly become super clunky, like you're a complete beginner. You stop just going with the flow and overthink things, leading to more rigid and tense motions, which obviously result in you shanking shots or mistiming moves. Another negative consequence of these physical changes can be accompanying changes in your emotional state, particularly in negative ways. It can result in us feeling a lot more panic and fear, again, despite the situation being one that we've faced many times before, just in a more relaxed setting. So unfortunately, when choking, not only does your immediate performance suffer, but it can trigger a vicious cycle of negative emotions, making it much more likely that you'll choke again and have performance anxiety become one of your worst enemies. But what actually causes the vast majority of performers to fall into this trap, and only a select few instead manage to remain fully composed during high pressure situations? Well, typically from the athletes and high performers I've worked with, there tends to be three main reasons. One, a lack of preparation. It's why most students fear exams, because deep down they know they haven't done enough studying and revision. They've tried to cram a year's worth of work of content into 2 weeks of all-nighters. Deep down they know they didn't do enough work. That's why they're praying and hoping that certain topics don't come up in the test. Compare that to the student who was in the library 5 days a week all year. He's completely at ease going into his exams and remains completely composed irrespective of whatever difficult questions come up. He's seen and practiced all of them before. Simple. Then two is fear of failure. Naturally, we will gravitate towards the cognitive bias of loss aversion, which means the pain of losing is psychologically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. So we spend so much of our attention obsessing over trying to move away from defeat instead of moving towards victory. And so that causes us to not direct attention to actually executing the skill, movement, or actions that will result in success. And instead we get caught up in those thoughts of, what if I miss? Or what if I screw up? And during the heat of the moment, your brain latches upon the most salient information. So it processes things poorly and focuses on miss or screw up, which again leads to a lot of panic and then clunky movements or execution that ends up just guaranteeing that failure. But the clutch performer, someone who seems to always make it count when the pressure is really on, he or she just obsesses over victory instead of failure. Thoughts of failure do not even cross their mind. They just remain laser focused on just executing. They actually detach themselves from the outcome, so they don't do any form of mental time travel where they imagine themselves losing or winning. All they focus on is the present moment and going through the motions of the task at hand. There's no fear, only fulfillment of their duty. And the last thing is a close cousin of fear of failure, and that is self-doubt. The choker begins to start questioning their abilities, their skills, or fitness in the most pressurized moments. And self-doubt is a natural thing we have all inherited as part of evolution. It allows us to avoid complacency or to avoid making silly mistakes. A little bit of doubt stops you from just recklessly jumping from rock to rock when climbing a mountain, or causes you to be more thoughtful about changing lanes on the highway when you're driving. But unfortunately, self-doubt can easily creep into high pressure moments, even when it's a task that we're an expert in. We may have memorized our speech word for word or taken thousands of golf putts from 10 feet before, but when the result actually counts, our brain likes to chime in with a bit of doubt. And this obviously gets in the way of the perfect execution that we're looking for. But again, the clutch performer, he or she doesn't let this self-doubt emerge, or they just instantly shut it down or detach from it. They retain 100% trust and faith in their abilities, which allows true confidence to be sustained. They protect themselves from letting doubt seep in. So the big question now is, how can you go from a choker to a clutch performer? Well, the secret is mental skills training. Most clutch performers at some point used to be chokers, but they learned, practiced, and consistently applied mental strategies to stay composed amid all forms of chaos. And there are plenty to choose from, far too many to cover in this video alone, but if you want a reliable guide on these tools, you may be interested in my ebook, The Mindset Manual, which covers in detail all the top mental tools that elite performers turn to in order to stop choking under pressure. You can check it out using the link in the description. But for now, let me get you started with 3 things that I think every single performer should be using on a consistent basis. Number 1 has to be pressure desensitization. I've spoken about this a couple of times in previous videos, but it's so important. You have to practice under pressure, and don't be afraid to be extreme about it. Tiger Woods' dad Earl Woods would jingle change in his pocket while Tiger practiced his putting as a child. And the point was just to condition Tiger to execute, irrespective of distractions. And if you think about it, how else did he manage to become so cold when he would have hundreds, if not thousands of fans following him around for every single shot that he took during major competitions? That only came from Earl deliberately engaging in what he called psychological warfare tactics to build Tiger's mental resilience. Quite simply, your body and mind has to get used to being able to perform the same things over and over, so much so that any new environment or set of conditions is not something that phases you in the slightest. And this also helps you become familiar with performing when actually in that fight-flight mode. You want to mirror the in-game or in-performance conditions as much as possible. If you don't, when you're typically practicing, you're doing it in a relaxed state, which is the polar opposite of what you will actually physiologically face on game day. So be creative. Easy ones to implement are practicing under time constraints, practicing with loud distracting noises, or doing extra reps of something when you're really tired at the end of a training session to replicate having to do shots or sprints on heavy legs. Then number 2 is to use downers. So what I mean by this is, during those moments where the pressure's on and the fight-flight changes are coming on strong, you need to deliberately dial things down a notch, because performance and stress follow an inverted U. Too much arousal is what causes everything to fall apart, but we need a decent level of arousal to fuel peak performance. You want an elevated heart rate and breathing rate to a certain extent. So things you should practice are breathing techniques. Even simple 3 seconds in and 3 seconds out a few times is a great way to dial that arousal level down a touch. Minimizing or instructional self-talk mantras are also super helpful. Just saying to yourself, "I've got this," or focusing on simple task-related cues helps you keep your mind strictly focused on the action, instead of allowing your mind to wander onto all those different thoughts about fearing failure. Also, positive distraction can be a good downer to engage in. Someone like Usain Bolt openly admitted that he never thought about his races until he actually started taking his mark. He'd do his silly poses and dances to distract himself, because he knew that the second he thought about the race, he could get caught up in a negative spiral. And even someone like the world-class footballer Kevin De Bruyne, he plays Candy Crush on his phone before big games in order to keep his nerves at bay. These are deliberate things that are intentionally engaged with to preoccupy the mind so that a cycle of self-doubt just doesn't seep in. And both of these downers also tie into thing 3, which is to engage in a sophisticated range of pre-performance routines. These are one of the best things any performer can implement in order to clear the mind, get into the moment, and lock into a skill so that it flows as if on autopilot. And to learn how to develop your own pre-performance routines, then you should watch this video next.